All right, welcome to your deep dive. Um, this time, you guys have said it was some pretty spicy material.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, audio from a dating seminar all about male-female sexual dynamics and techniques. Buckle up. This is going to be interesting.
Oh, wow. Sounds intense.
It is. So what I found fascinating is how the seminar leader kicks things off by really emphasizing the biological differences between men and women when it comes to getting turned on.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
He argues that men tend to experience arousal pretty quickly and straightforwardly, almost like flipping a switch.
Right. And he actually uses the term urgency to describe the typical male experience,
Yeah,
contrasting it with the female experience, which he describes as slow cooking.
I was going to say slow cooking. Yeah, what do you make of that analogy?
Well, I think it highlights that for many women, arousal is a slower, more complex process that involves anticipation and a gradual buildup of tension.
Okay.
He even suggests that men could learn a lot by observing lesbian pornography, where the focus tends to be on prolonged touching, eye contact, and really drawing out the tension.
That's an interesting suggestion, to say the least.
Yeah,
But I can see how understanding this difference in pacing could be really important.
absolutely. He believes that men often miss the mark because they rush things, not realizing that building anticipation can be incredibly arousing for women.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because
Yeah.
he claims that sexual tension, which a lot of men find uncomfortable, is actually a huge turn-on for women.
Right.
He links it to a sense of ambiguity, like being slightly withheld from what you want, which
Mm,
just cranks up that anticipation.
exactly.
So how does he actually suggest using this? Like, how do you create that tension in a real-life interaction?
Well, he even uses this routine where he has a woman sit on her hands, close her eyes, and then he keeps talking in a very suggestive way.
Okay.
Apparently, it makes it almost impossible for her to reject him when he finally goes in for a kiss.
Wow. That's a bold strategy. I can see how it plays into that whole idea of tension and anticipation.
Yeah.
Do you think that actually works? Or is it kind of manipulative?
It's certainly thought-provoking. Um, he believes this approach makes him stand out from guys who respond to tension by either getting anxious or coming on too strong.
Right.
He seems to think that embracing sexual tension, even leaning into it, is what creates a more compelling and exciting experience for women.
Okay, so he's not saying avoid the tension, but like lean into it.
Right.
Okay.
Yes, use it to your advantage.
It definitely challenges the typical advice of just trying to make a woman feel completely comfortable all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So are you saying a little bit of discomfort can actually be a good thing?
Well, he seems to think so, but it's a fine line, wouldn't you
Yeah.
say? You have to be confident and calibrated to pull that off without making the woman feel uneasy.
Right, you don't want to go too far.
It makes you wonder how much of this is about genuine connection versus just using techniques.
That's a great point, and something we should definitely keep in mind as we explore the rest of this seminar. Now, he also delves into this good girl, bad girl dichotomy. He claims that every woman has both sides to her, and relating to both is essential for a fulfilling sexual relationship. What do you make of that?
Well, it's interesting how he challenges those simplistic labels. He argues that all women, even someone like Oprah, who you might consider a good girl figure, enjoy naughty and dirty things.
Mhm.
He's basically saying those desires are not limited to women who fit certain stereotypes.
So he's pushing back against the idea that you can put women in neat little boxes.
Hmm.
I can see how that could be liberating for some women, but it also makes me wonder if it's a bit reductive. Is it fair to categorize women like that at all?
That's a valid question. It's a delicate balance between recognizing the complexity of female desire and avoiding harmful generalizations. Perhaps it's more about understanding that each individual woman has her own unique set of desires and preferences.
He also talks about the importance of men projecting sexual comfort, claiming it helps women feel more comfortable exploring their own sexuality. He tells this story about reassuring a woman who is feeling insecure about experimenting sexually after a breakup.
Hmm.
What did you think about that story and how he framed it?
He emphasized that her exploration was admirable, not something to be ashamed of.
Okay.
It's a great example of how a man's words can really impact a woman's self-perception and how she feels about her own sexuality.
So it sounds like he's advocating for creating a safe space where women feel free to express their desires without judgment.
Absolutely.
Imagine that could be pretty powerful.
It seems he believes this non-judgmental attitude is key to fostering a woman's comfort and encouraging her to explore more freely. But it also makes you wonder, what does projecting sexual comfort actually look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. It can't just be about saying the right words. It probably has a lot to do with body language, energy, and overall demeanor, right?
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're getting into some really nuanced territory here. It's forcing us to think critically about these concepts.
Now, the seminar also gets to some pretty specific techniques. He's a big fan of erotic storytelling and phone sex, arguing they can engage a woman's imagination and build emotional comfort around potentially taboo desires before actually acting on them.
He even explains how this can make a woman more receptive to something like a threesome.
Okay.
By introducing it in a safe, arousing context, she can explore the fantasy in her mind before anything physical happens. It's like dipping your toes in the water before jumping in.
Okay. That makes sense. So it's not just about getting her in the mood. It's about creating a sense of safety and exploration around desires that might be considered taboo or off limits.
Exactly. He seems to believe that these methods can help to bridge the gap between fantasy and reality, allowing a woman to feel more comfortable and empowered to explore her desires more fully.
It makes you wonder, though, how much of this is about genuine desire versus just getting caught up in a fantasy.
That's a valid point. It's always important to be mindful of the distinction between genuine desire and something that's just a product of suggestion or fantasy. And that brings us to one of the most detailed sections of the seminar, female orgasms.
Yeah, he really goes deep on this, talking about different types of orgasms, the importance of patience, reducing performance pressure. It's a lot to unpack.
He places a lot of emphasis on observation, suggesting that men pay close attention to a woman's responses to figure out what feels good. He even encourages a collaborative approach where the woman guides her partner's touch or even stimulates herself under her partner's guidance.
It's fascinating how much he focuses on tailoring the experience to the individual woman rather than relying on a one-size-fits-all approach. It's almost like he's saying, forget the generic moves and really focus on what works for her.
Absolutely. He seems to believe that true pleasure comes from understanding your partner's unique responses and working together to create an experience that's truly satisfying for both of you.
He even mentions specific techniques like the welcome method for clitoral stimulation, which I have to admit I've never heard of before.
It involves stimulating the clitoris at a specific angle to prevent overstimulation, which is an interesting concept.
Okay.
He also talks about a technique called the hoop, which is apparently a more intense method of G-spot stimulation.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. It seems like he's all about encouraging men to go beyond the basics and really explore different techniques to find what works best for their partner.
It's definitely not your typical sex ed class.
All right, let's dive into one of the more, shall we say, delicate topics he covers, female ejaculation. It sounds like he really wants to demystify it and take away the stigma.
Absolutely. He explains that it's completely separate from urination and can be incredibly pleasurable for women. He outlines a process involving prolonged G-spot stimulation and encouraging the woman to push, despite the fear of peeing, which I imagine could be a hurdle for some.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of anxiety around that.
Yeah.
It seems like building trust and reassurance is key here.
He really stresses clear communication and reassurance, suggesting that men directly address the fear of urination and emphasize that the sensation is normal, pleasurable, and definitely not urine. He even gets into the biology of it, talking about the Skene glands, which produce the fluid during female ejaculation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's interesting because he suggests that many women might experience a sensation of needing to pee after sex due to these glands being engorged, but they don't feel comfortable enough to fully release.
Right.
That raises an interesting question, doesn't it? Could it be that some women are experiencing a form of female ejaculation without even realizing it? And if so, what does that say about the role of education and communication in unlocking that potential for pleasure?
That's a great point. It seems like there's a lot more to this than just the physical mechanics. There's a whole layer of emotional and psychological factors at play as well.
And that's what makes this deep dive so intriguing. We're not just talking about techniques. We're exploring the complex interplay between biology, psychology, and communication in the context of sexual intimacy.
Definitely.
Well said. Speaking of complex, the seminar also gets into the topic of dominance and rough sex. He claims that most women enjoy a degree of dominance, particularly in the bedroom, finding pleasure in being swept away and losing control.
Mm-hmm.
So what are your initial thoughts on that?
Well, he suggests that rougher acts like hair pulling, spanking, and biting can be enjoyable, but emphasizes the importance of a safe word and being attentive to the woman's responses. It's about finding that balance between exploring those desires and ensuring everyone feels safe and respected.
He even talks about establishing a safe word as a way to gauge a woman's interest in rougher activities. If she seems hesitant or surprised by the idea of a safe word, that might be a sign to dial things back a bit.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that consent and communication are absolutely paramount, especially when you're exploring these more intense forms of sexual expression.
He also cautions against making assumptions about a woman's preferences based on her personality or appearance. Just because a woman is typically independent and assertive in other areas of her life doesn't necessarily mean she enjoys being dominated in the bedroom.
That's a really important point. It reinforces the idea that there's no one-size-fits-all approach
Yeah.
to sexuality.
Right.
Each woman is unique, and it's about understanding her individual desires and boundaries.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a really interesting question. It's interesting how the seminar leader also touches on the psychological barriers that men themselves face when it comes to sex. He encourages men to examine their own beliefs and attitudes, especially those that might make them feel like sex is inherently wrong or dirty.
Oh, interesting. I can see how those kinds of beliefs would get in the way.
Exactly. He argues that these beliefs are often outdated and unproductive, urging men to embrace a more positive and liberating view of sex as something natural and enjoyable.
Yeah, makes sense. So it's not just about understanding women, but also understanding yourself and where you're coming from.
Exactly. He even challenges the idea that sex is something a woman gives to a man. I definitely heard that kind of language before, and it does create a weird sense of obligation.
Yeah, it definitely sets up an odd tower dynamic.
He suggests that this framing can create an imbalance and instead emphasizes seeing sex as a shared experience where both partners adamantly give and receive pleasure.
Okay, I like that reframing.
Yeah.
It feels more balanced and mutual. So it's not about taking or receiving, it's about sharing.
Right.
Okay.
Now, going back to that idea of projecting sexual comfort, he argues that it's not just about making women feel comfortable, but that it can actually make men more attractive.
So he's saying that women are drawn to men who are confident and at ease with their own sexuality.
That's right. He believes that this sense of comfort creates a safe and inviting space for women to explore their own desires without fear of being judged.
Okay, so it goes both ways.
Exactly.
But he also warns against faking it, right? Like it can't just be an act.
Exactly. He emphasizes that the comfort needs to be genuine because women can usually sense when a man is putting on a facade. It makes you think about how we often talk about women being intuitive, but maybe men are picking up on those subtle cues too.
I think you're onto something there. Now, earlier we were talking about embracing tension, and this idea of projecting sexual comfort might seem a bit contradictory.
It's true, they do seem like opposite approaches, but maybe the key is finding a balance between being comfortable with the uncertainty that comes with sexual exploration while also radiating a sense of self-assuredness and acceptance.
That makes a lot of sense.
I
It's
don't
about
know.
being confident in your own skin, both literally and figuratively.
To illustrate this idea of a non-judgmental attitude, he shares a story about a woman who was feeling insecure about her sexual experiences after a breakup. She was worried about being perceived as a slut, but he reassured her that her exploration was actually admirable.
It's a great reminder that a man's words can be incredibly powerful in shaping a woman's self-perception. By validating her choices and affirming her right to explore, he helped her to embrace her desires without shame.
It also highlights how men can play a crucial role in supporting women's sexual liberation and empowering them to own their desires.
Now let's circle back to the idea of the bad girl side he mentioned earlier. He seems to think that engaging this side is key to unlocking deeper levels of pleasure and excitement for women. I'm curious to hear more about his strategies for doing that.
Well, he talks about creating a safe context for naughty activities, using language that taps into those desires, and even encouraging men to explore their own rougher side.
Wait, is he suggesting that most women actually enjoy a certain degree of dominance in the bedroom?
That's what he claims. He even suggests that acts like hair pulling, spanking, and biting can be incredibly arousing for women. But he stresses the importance of clear communication and consent, making sure everyone's on the same page.
That's definitely pushing the boundaries a bit. It makes you wonder how much of this is rooted in genuine desire versus societal conditioning. It's like, are these women truly into it, or have they just been taught to respond to these kinds of acts?
It's a good question, and honestly, one that's hard to answer definitively. But regardless of the underlying reasons, It's clear that consent and communication are non-negotiable when exploring these more intense forms of sexual expression.
He also mentioned the power of erotic storytelling and phone sex. How do those fit into the picture?
He argues that by engaging a woman's imagination and building emotional comfort around those taboo fantasies, you can create a powerful sense of anticipation and make her more receptive to actually acting them out.
It's like building a bridge between the fantasy world and reality. I guess it makes sense if you can create a safe and arousing context through storytelling. It might feel less intimidating to actually try those things in real life.
He even shares a funny anecdote about a time when he tried to incorporate some dirty talk into his sexual encounters, but it came out all wrong and didn't have the desired effect.
I have a feeling a lot of people can relate to that. It makes it so much more relatable that even this guy who's leading a seminar on this stuff can still have those awkward moments.
It's a good reminder that these techniques require practice and a certain level of comfort to execute effectively. If you're trying too hard or sound overly rehearsed, it can totally backfire.
He also stresses the importance of being genuine and confident, arguing that if you already believe it's going to be weird, it probably will.
And of course, paying attention to a woman's responses and adjusting your approach accordingly is crucial. What works for one woman might not work for another, and respecting her boundaries and comfort levels is paramount.
He even suggests adding some humor to these interactions,
I like that.
using lightheartedness and playfulness to diffuse any potential awkwardness. It doesn't always have to be so serious and intense.
Exactly. Sometimes a little laughter and lighthearted teasing can go a long way in creating a more fun and enjoyable experience.
Okay, let's get into the specifics. He spends a lot of time talking about techniques for stimulating different areas of the female anatomy, the clitoris, the G-spot, and what he calls the deep spot.
He even uses a cell phone as a prop to help men visualize the location of these areas, which I have to admit is pretty creative.
It's a little out there, but hey, if it works.
He emphasizes the importance of experimenting with different techniques and pressures to find what feels good for each woman. He also talks about communication and feedback, encouraging men to ask their partners what they like and adjust their approach accordingly.
It sounds like he's really pushing for a collaborative approach, which I appreciate. It's not just about the man knowing all the right moves. It's about working together to discover what feels good for both partners.
He even suggests having the woman guide her partner's touch or even stimulate herself under her partner's guidance, which adds another level of intimacy and communication to the experience.
I like that. It's like a guided exploration of pleasure, which sounds a lot more fun than just following a script.
He also talks about the importance of building up to more intense sensations gradually. Starting with lighter touches and working your way up can create a more pleasurable experience.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like creating a crescendo of sensations. And he mentioned a specific technique called the welcome method for clitoral stimulation, which I'm still curious about.
It involves stimulating the clitoris at a specific angle to prevent overstimulation, which is interesting because it goes against what a lot of people might assume is the best approach.
Right. And then there's the hook technique for G-spot stimulation, which he describes in some pretty vivid detail. It seems like he's really encouraging men to go beyond the basics and explore a variety of techniques.
He also talks about the importance of being patient and persistent, especially when it comes to helping a woman achieve orgasm. He reminds us that some women take longer to reach climax, and it's important to avoid putting pressure on them or making them feel inadequate if it doesn't happen quickly.
That's a really important point. It's not a race to the finish line. It's about enjoying the journey together.
Exactly. And creating a relaxing and comfortable environment can make a big difference too. He suggests things like candles, music, and massage to set the mood and enhance the experience.
He even recommends avoiding violin music, saying that studies have shown that women find piano music more conducive to sexual arousal. I wouldn't have guessed that.
It's funny how these subtle details can actually have an impact on our experience.
He also talks about aftercare, the importance of continuing to show affection and attention after sex. It's easy to forget that intimacy doesn't just end when the act is over.
It's about fostering a deeper sense of connection that lingers long after the physical act is finished.
Now, he also gets into the sensitive topic of sexual frustration, suggesting that many women aren't fully satisfied with their sex lives. What are some of the reasons he gives for this?
He mentions infrequent sex, unsatisfying partners, and a lack of understanding of their own bodies and desires.
It makes you wonder how much of this frustration stems from societal pressures and expectations.
He encourages men to be sensitive to these potential frustrations and to approach sex with a genuine desire to please and satisfy their partner. He even suggests that if a woman isn't experiencing orgasm regularly, She might need to start masturbating more, which is pretty bold advice.
That's definitely stepping outside the traditional boundaries of what men are supposed to tell women. But I can see how it ties into his overall message of encouraging women to explore their own sexuality and take ownership of their pleasure.
He stresses the importance of open and honest conversations about these topics, advocating for communication and mutual exploration. But he also spends quite a bit of time talking about confidence and dominance as being attractive to women, arguing that women are drawn to men who are assertive and in control.
That seems a little contradictory to the idea of creating a safe space for a woman to explore her own desires. How do those two things coexist?
He clarifies that dominance doesn't necessarily mean being aggressive or controlling, but rather having a confident, decisive energy that allows the woman to relax and surrender to the experience. It's more about leading with a clear intention and a sense of purpose.
So it's about finding that balance between being assertive and being respectful. That makes a lot more sense.
He even suggests that women who are typically independent and self-sufficient often enjoy relinquishing control in a sexual context, allowing themselves to be swept away by a man's strength and confidence.
It's an interesting idea. I guess it challenges some of our assumptions about what women want. He also acknowledges that some women prefer to take a more dominant role in the bedroom.
But he suggests that this dynamic might be less common and often requires a deeper level of emotional connection or a pre-negotiated arrangement.
That makes sense. It's all about open communication and mutual understanding, regardless of who's taking the lead.
He also encourages men to pay attention to a woman's nonverbal cues and adjust their behavior accordingly. And when it comes to exploring rougher sexual activities, he stresses the importance of having a safe word, not just as a safety measure, but also as a way to gauge a woman's comfort level.
It's a reminder that consent and communication are ongoing processes, not just something you check off at the beginning of an encounter. And it's crucial to be aware of individual preferences and boundaries.
It's refreshing how he balances his emphasis on techniques and strategies with the importance of respecting a woman's individual needs and desires.
I think this deep dive is a great reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to sex and relationships. It's about being willing to learn, explore, and communicate openly with your partner to create an experience that's truly satisfying for both of you. But before we wrap things up, there's one more section of the seminar we need to cover.
It's the part about one-night stands.
Oh, right. One-night stands. Okay, so what does he have to say about navigating those waters?
Well, he acknowledges that sometimes you might sleep with someone and realize you don't want to pursue anything further, which can be a tricky situation.
Yeah, for sure. You don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, but you also have to be honest with yourself.
Exactly. And he offers some advice on how to handle that without leading the woman on or making her feel used.
Okay, I'm curious. What's his approach?
He emphasizes being honest with yourself about your intentions
Right.
and communicating those intentions clearly but subtly to the woman.
Subtly, that's the key, right?
Yeah.
So how do you do that?
He even suggests specific phrases like, maybe I'll call you if you're lucky, which kind of conveys that there's no guarantee of future contact without being, explicitly rejecting.
I see. It leaves things open-ended, but doesn't make any promises.
Exactly. He also talks about taking a woman's number, even if you don't plan on calling her, as a way to soften the potential rejection.
Interesting. Almost like giving her a chance to save face.
Right. He compares it to how women often reject men by taking their number but never calling, allowing the man to gradually realize he's been rejected rather than delivering a harsh upfront blow.
It's interesting how these subtle social dynamics play out.
Yeah.
It's all about managing expectations and minimizing hurt feelings.
Exactly.
So what about the flip side? What if you do want to see her again after a one-night stand?
Well, he also addresses that common anxiety men feel about whether or not to call a woman after a one-night stand.
Right. It's the classic should I call, should I not call dilemma.
He argues that if you've projected sexual comfort and communicated effectively throughout the encounter, the woman shouldn't be worried about whether or not you'll call.
Okay, so it's about treating a dynamic where both people feel good about what happened.
Right, and they don't feel the need for constant reassurance.
Makes sense. What about those awkward questions that sometimes come up? Like, do you do this all the time? How does he suggest handling those?
He suggests handling those with humor and confidence, deflecting the question rather than getting bogged down in a serious discussion.
Keep it light.
Exactly.
Mindful.
He gives some examples of witty responses that convey sexual experience without sounding arrogant.
Okay, so threading that needle carefully.
Right. It's a delicate balance between acknowledging your attractiveness without making the woman feel like just another conquest.
Now, we've talked a lot about techniques and strategies, but I'm
hmm
curious, what does he have to say about meeting women in the first place?
Well, he shares some insights into his own approach, particularly on the dance floor.
Okay, let's hear it. I love a good dance floor strategy.
He describes a strategy of dancing with a group of women, giving each one individual attention before, like, spinning her off and moving on to the next.
Almost like creating a sense of playful rejection.
Exactly. He suggests that this can actually make the women more intrigued and likely to seek him out later.
Interesting. It's counterintuitive, right? It challenges the idea that you need to constantly shower a woman with attention to win her over.
He also talks about being selective and focusing your energy on women who seem genuinely interested rather than trying to convince those who are lukewarm.
It's about recognizing when there's a spark,
Yes, and not wasting time on dead ends.
efficiency, maximizing your opportunities.
Especially in environments like bars or clubs where there are many potential connections.
Makes sense. Now, I imagine he doesn't only advocate for cold approaches, right?
Right. He acknowledges that cold approaches aren't the only way to meet women and that your existing social network can be a valuable resource.
Oh, for sure.
He talks about understanding social dynamics, building rapport with key individuals in the group, and using those relationships to your advantage.
Leveraging your social capital.
Exactly.
Are there any risks to that approach, though?
Well, he stresses being respectful of everyone involved
Okay, good.
and avoiding any behavior that could create drama or tension within the group.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to mess things up with your friends.
Exactly.
So does he give any specific examples of how to do this well?
Yeah. He even shares an example of how he used his connection with a friend's girlfriend to create a sense of comfort and trust with a woman he was interested in.
Okay, so social proof, using pre-existing relationships to your advantage. Interesting.
It highlights how social proof and pre-existing relationships can influence a woman's perception of you.
Wow, this deep dive has been quite a journey. It's fascinating how he blends psychological insights, practical techniques, and even social dynamics into a comprehensive perspective on attraction and seduction.
It's definitely a lot to unpack, but whether or not you agree with all his ideas, he certainly pushes us to think critically about our own beliefs and behaviors when it comes to sex and relationships.
It's about challenging our assumptions, expanding our understanding, and exploring the possibilities for deeper connection and fulfillment in our own lives.
And that's ultimately what makes a deep dive so rewarding.
So as we wrap up this rather explicit exploration, I'm left wondering how much of our sexual satisfaction is determined by external factors like techniques and strategies, and how much of it comes from within, from our own beliefs, attitudes, and our ability to embrace vulnerability and connection.
That's a really insightful question and one that deserves further reflection.
It seems like finding that balance between the external and the internal, the technical and the emotional, is key to creating a truly satisfying and meaningful sexual experience.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with that thought to ponder. Until next time, happy diving.